Okay, let's get started, everyone. Welcome back for the third installment of Turning Point. Before we go any further, uh, I want to again express solidarity. I know that each of you in turn will be addressing what's been going on, not only in America, but at home through each of your organizations or for yourselves personally. But I want to ensure that we say at the outset that we stand by and we stand with those who are fighting against systemic racism in North America and globally. And I sincerely welcome you back again for this third installment. It's the second of the week. We've been spending a lot of time together digging in to this material, and it's for a good cause. For those of you who are just tuning in to Turning Point, this is our opportunity to collectively rediscover and reimagine New Brunswick for all of us on the other side of COVID-19. It's a webinar series, but it's also a podcast series. We're trying to reach you where you are at whatever medium you're comfortable with engaging. So the topic today is the New Brunswick economy. The question remains, how do we prioritize partnerships and investments that fuel recovery and growth? And what new models of investments and efficiencies should we reconsider? For those who don't know me, I'm Matt George. I'm the founder of the Unsettled Media Podcast Network, and I'll be your moderator and co-host of the podcast with my friend David Campbell. And don't forget, we are releasing those as podcasts under the Growing Pains with David Campbell podcast thread. You'll find that on Apple, Spotify, Google, anywhere that you get podcasts. And for those that missed the webinars, we do record these and we put them out at turningpointnb.ca. So make sure you head over there and check out the recorded webinars. Before we go any further and we talk about ground rules and engagement, I want to recognize again the partners that make this possible every time we do get together. That's the New Brunswick Business Council, Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters, Tech Impact, the New Brunswick Multicultural Council, the Chambers of Commerce in Moncton, Fredericton, and St. John, Conseil économique de Nouveau-Brunswick, Atlantic Chamber of Commerce, the Pondage Pondé Center at the University of New Brunswick, and our partners at the Government of New Brunswick and ACOA. And for a full list of presenting partners, head to turningpointnb.ca. So I do want to set some ground rules for audience engagement. I want to make this as productive for you as possible. The only reason I'm here is to be a stand-in for your voice. What that means is we want you to engage. As you hear our lead facilitators, as you hear our panelists, please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen within Zoom or the chat function to the right of your screen on Zoom. We're also going to be introducing a poll. You'll see two polls pop up throughout the course of this introduction. We want to be able to take your pulse. We want to know what you're thinking when you're hearing this content. We want to know what questions you want answered. We want to know how you're feeling. So you'll see those polls pop up, and please do engage with those as we go. We really want that feedback. There will be a poll coming at the end of the show as well. Before you sign off for the day, we'll go for about an hour. Before you sign off for the day, please do also fill out that poll so we can take that over to the podcast and talk about that as well. If we have any delays or technology interruptions, please do stick with us. Obviously, there's a risk to doing something like this live, but we put measures in place to mitigate that happening. So hopefully our panelists and lead presenters won't have any technology issues as we go. For folks who are just tuning in, we want to frame this discussion in a way that's useful. Of course, we're talking about challenges and innovation going forward, but we want to know, what do we do next? How do we put a framework around this that allows us to take something useful from it? And so given that, our committee came up with a framework of 4 questions. These have also been published as what's known as the 4 Noble Truths. And I'll very briefly go through what those are before introducing our lead facilitator for the day. Number 1 is, what is the pain we're feeling given the topics that we're discussing? Number 2 is, what is the cause of that pain? So what can we point to provincially that's led us to our current state of affairs? 3, how does that pain get better? So what actions can we take now to prevent future pain? And 4, how do we look confidently towards the future? what does that future state look like for New Brunswick? And I know we're all very keen on understanding within each category, what does that look like? So with that, I get to very happily introduce our lead facilitator for this session. We're welcoming back Dr. Herb Emery. Dr. Emery holds the Vaughan Chair in Regional Economics at the University of New Brunswick since July 2016. Herb is Program Chair for the J.D. Irving Roundtable on Manufacturing Competitiveness in New Brunswick and Director of the Atlantic Institute for Policy Research. He holds a master's and a doctorate in economics from the University of British Columbia. His academic career began at the University of Calgary, where from 1993 to 2016, he established a track record of excellence in research, teaching, and in leadership. Dr. Emery's work incorporates political, historical, cultural, and other institutional factors that have shaped Canadian development processes. Welcome, Dr. Emery. The screen is yours. Thanks for being with us on Turning Point.
Thanks, Matt. I'll just move to sharing my screen. Okay, Matt, can you let me know if you're seeing that okay?
You're good to go.
Okay, thanks everyone for being here today. And I have a very brief amount of time to explain why the economy stopped growing, what could make it grow, and what are our options going forward. So what I want to start with, just to give you some context, is that Premier Blaine Higgs has established a 2% annual growth target in our GDP per year. And the reason that's interesting to think about is that that's the kind of growth rates this province had up until around 2006. And since that time, the province has struggled to sustain anything close to a 1% increase in GDP and often hovering around zero, when the rest of the country's been up around 2 to 4%. Now, I'll get into why that matters in a second, but how is he going to achieve this? He's going to use a combination of population growth, and he's going to use in addition, productivity growth, which can be spurred by investment to raise how much a worker can produce in an hour of work, and through innovation, research, and development. Currently, New Brunswick is lacking in the innovation and R&D funding to do that, and we've been lacking in investment for some time. And so we've started with population growth, but we're still well below that 1% we would need in order to hit the Premier's target. Now, the growth dividend, if we can do what the Premier's asked and get to 2%, is if you think about total government expenditures, which is the red line, they've been trending up steadily since 1999. So they haven't really stopped growing. And the problem we have is that revenues did around 2008. The debt we're dealing with today is the gap between the red and the black line that's accumulated because that was the borrowing we did waiting for revenues to come back. And now they're there and they're in line, but we're in balance with no money left in surplus to pay off the debt that we've accumulated. And Richard Seance talked about the fiscal situation. If we carry on as we are with the same growth rate in public expenditures, that's the red line that's dashed going forward to 2030 where we'll be. And if we continue to grow at the same rate, and I'm ignoring the 5% contraction in GDP expected for post-COVID, we would barely be in line with our spending. And so what we would be in imbalance and perpetually in debt. If you can maintain the growth of spending and get 2% growth in GDP and revenue, you start to open up that spread, and in 10 years, you would have enough surplus to pay off the debt in entirety. So a 2% growth rate compared to where we are today with restraint in spending is enough to deal with that fiscal situation everyone's worried about. So if you wonder why the Premier's interested in growth, why 2% is a reasonable target, it's because it's where we were before. We can get there again, and it's a combination of more population in the province, research and development, and more investment. Now, what drives this economy and what led us to the state we're in with low to slow growth? This is an index of gross domestic product for the province, the value of all goods and services that we produce. And what you'll see is that, oh, sorry, this one is exports. I had them out of order. This is an index where it's the value of exports in a given year relative to its peak value in 2010. Now, if I take gross domestic product and look at how it grows, what you find is when you compare these series is that we tend to have strong economic growth in New Brunswick when we have growth in exports. And when exports aren't growing, we tend to have stagnation in GDP. So this is why you'll often hear economists talking about small open economies like New Brunswick, that exports are the engine, and why you have the Premier, ACOA, and the federal government really fixated on we got to get exports going again. If you think about when times were good, it's when our exports and what the world was demanding for us was high. And when that went away after 2008, we've been struggling to grow. And if we throw in investment, the blue line, what we tend to see is that we do get investment coming into the province, which is raising productivity. And as late as 2006, the amount of output a worker in New Brunswick produced per hour was as high as Ontario. And since 2008, with no growth in investment and the capital stock, we're now as poor as Nova Scotia in terms of labor productivity. So we've completely stagnated on that margin, which could have been a source for growth. And then when you get into private sector employment, the business sector is largely driven by exports and how it's spilling over through the multipliers and linkages. So when we talk about exports as the engine, it's because it has this powerful demand side draw for investment, population, and growing our income so that we can afford to pay for the goods and services that we want. The other thing we have to worry about is with slow growth is that you get an unhealthy source of population aging. So this figure on, I'm not sure who's left and right, but one panel is showing age distributions by year in the population for New Brunswick going up towards 800,000. And what you'll notice is at the bottom, 0 to 17-year-olds and 18 to 24-year-olds is declining in absolute number. So we're getting population aging from two sources. It's a hollowing out of our young population and a growing number of people who are in the baby boom years, middle age and older. If I contrast that to Ontario in the other panel, which has been growing its GDP steadily and adding immigration and adding population, you'll see that they don't have a fall in the absolute number of their younger population. They really have a relative increase in the baby boomers in the population. So we have unhealthy population aging because we're actually losing our future generation that we need to be our workers to raise the GDP and pay for everything. Whereas in Ontario, they're just dealing with a relative increase because they have growth, which has been drawing in the young population, retaining it. Now, if you think about what makes our economy grow and what do we have, 25% of our economy, the export-driven sector, is coming from manufacturing, durable and non-durable, and goods production. So tangible things that you can send to someone somewhere else in the world, like a commodity. This could be your seafood, it could be your trees. That makes up about 25% of our economy and accounts for a large share of the exports that we do. The public sector accounts for about 27%. This is the broad public sector, public administration plus all education and all healthcare. And then service sector, which is not the public sector, is about half, 48%. And just for context, because ICT is going to be discussed a lot, that accounts for 4% of our GDP. So when we're talking about trying to replace traditional industries, we're starting at 4% of our GDP, and we're looking at how do you get closer to a quarter if we're going to start displacing industries that we'll get down to below. How do we earn a living? Well, it closely aligns with what you see in the what makes up our GDP. The total labor force is that black line up above, and you'll see it's flattened out since 2008 with our aging population and more stagnant demand for labor in the business sector. And what's been going on over time is, in contrast to the rest of the world, which has been losing its goods producing sector and manufacturing employment, New Brunswick has maintained employment in that sector. And where we've been weak after 2008 is actually in the non-government business services sector. So our service sector employment's been declining, and it's been offset by a growth in healthcare employment and spending. So if we have any weakness, it's really been around, of late, non-competitive service sectors, in order that we can compete with the Amazons and places like that to retain more employment and more GDP. What do we export? Well, what we've been doing up until 2008 is we were exporting things like our forest products, manufactured wood products, and some energy, some consumer goods like furniture. And we got more exports by increasing the value out of what we would call our traditional sectors. So the green, the gray, the yellow, up to the dark blue. Since 2008, we've been much more reliant on adding new industries. So basic and industrial chemical, plastic, and rubber products is taking up a larger share of total exports. But I want to point out that even though you see the traditional areas that were larger closer to June 88 and falling, this is a proportion of total exports. They've maintained their absolute value, but just as we add more things that we export, they're declining as a share. Now, if you think about what we're looking at going forward, if you do something like a maritime iron, we're doing post 2008 growth, which is instead of making our traditional sectors more valuable by being more competitive, we're going to add more industries to the mix and export more products that maybe we didn't do before. Now, what's different about a maritime iron, a rubber, and even a petroleum is that they're not necessarily manufacturing based on our resource base that's here. So they're importing their inputs, adding some value, and sending them out to market. So their value added may not be as big an impact as their exports, but they are adding value and they are an export engine that will drive employment. Now, a bigger problem we have is that New Brunswick since 2008 is not producing like it used to. So if we look at exports, which plateaued after 2005, the value of them, exports of all goods and services, that's the red line. If I bring in imports, it has now exceeded exports by a wide margin. So you have to remember this is getting into the range of $5 billion in trade deficit. Why does this matter? Because we only have three sources of income at a broad level. One is the value of what we sell to the rest of the world to buy goods back from them, which is our exports. And in a healthy economy, what you hope for is some balance between your exports and imports so they offset. When you don't export enough and you're importing a lot, you can borrow, which means I'm going to take my income in the future and spend it today so that I can have those things now. And that's okay if it's an investment in a tangible asset that I'll have in future with benefits. But if I'm paying for services that I'm importing or non-durable goods, then that's money I've taken from the future or promised to pay someone at that time that won't be available, so a decreased standard of living. And the third item is transfers from somewhere else, like the federal government. So how we sustain this gap in consumption versus what we produce is one of the challenges going forward. As long as Ottawa is comfortable transferring to us, and as long as people are willing to lend to us, we can carry this on until that point stops. What makes economists nervous is we're not sure that you can sustain a trade deficit that large for very long. Now, I was asked to talk about, so if all this growth challenge is out there and economists are wringing their hands, what's the challenge of getting back to growth? Well, one problem in New Brunswick is everyone's happy, and that's probably a weird thing to hear. But if everyone's happy, why do we need to change? So when you look at respondents on surveys in Canada who are asked, are they satisfied or very satisfied with life, with an average being 100%, meaning you can't get any better, what we learn is that overall, New Brunswick is as happy as Ontarians, much happier than Nova Scotians, and our young population is extremely happy. Older populations like me, the grumpy old guys, we're the ones that seem to be grousing about everything and we're as miserable as Nova Scotians. But when you take a look at why is it so hard to change, nobody's that unhappy compared to anywhere else and we're not growing. So you have to explain to someone how growth is actually correlated with their well-being. And that's where I think we're having a struggle. With younger people, which is the orange line, this is again the percent saying they're satisfied or very satisfied with life. What we actually see is they're happier with no growth than they were with growth. And the older population is showing no trend difference in their happiness. So again, the challenge that the happiness researchers and economics have pointed out, there's no correlation between gross domestic product increase and a population's happiness, which creates a problem if you're trying to sell a policy. We need to increase our GDP, and it means changing from something you like. So our happiness or life satisfaction is one of the challenges for change. And if you're looking for innovation, you only innovate if you think something needs to be different. The other challenge is that most New Brunswickers that you might think about, let's say in the cities, they haven't experienced slow growth. The province grows slowly, but our cities are growing as rapidly in income and population size as the same size cities anywhere else in Canada. So the growth challenge isn't really being felt by them. And if you live in Moncton, you're not experiencing a stagnant economy, you're experiencing a booming economy. So when someone like me comes along and says, I'm worried about slow growth, you don't actually know what I'm talking about. You haven't experienced it. But if I go into rural New Brunswick, where we've hollowed out most of the economy, that's where most of the pain has been felt because they're not stagnating in terms of income, they're contracting. And so as we urbanize, we get overall net zero growth, but we're getting strong positive growth in certain centers, and a lot of those people are going to be very happy. potentially. So this brings us to the turning point. Yogi Berra's line, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. That seems to be where we're at today with COVID. People want to know, what should we do next if we want to have a good life? And so to do this, I'm going to give you two options, and I can't tell you which is the right one, because the opportunity that you believe the province should take depends on what you believe makes you happy or what makes more New Brunswickers happy. So my first option is to go back to the future. And what I mean by this is we would build on our traditional strengths. We would try and get our traditional export engines from the resource-based industries back on track. To do that, we have to address competitive challenges, which is having more affordable energy for producers. We would need to have social license issues resolved, transportation cost to market. This is going to be business sector driven. It's going to reduce our dependence on federal transfers and things like that. And it's going to be city focused, but with an emphasis on the hinterland of the cities. So you're trying to use your cities to concentrate wealth that's being created in the hinterland, which is not going to work well if you want to live in rural areas, but not have industrial production nearby. The other is to stay the new post-2008 course. And in this case, we can use the competitive challenges that have emerged in our economy that holds our exporters back, and we can use that pain to transform the economy. We can drive down we can limit our traditional strengths to create a path forward for new industries that we'll still have to name later which ones they'll be. It's going to have to be public sector driven, because if it was going to happen anyway, it would have happened by now. So you're going to need some source of capital through the public sector to drive this investment. It will be transfer dependent, because it will take the federal government to help us out because we're broke, and it's likely going to be city focused. There might be some small community development, but again, you're going to have to figure out where the money for that comes from and what industries it will be. So those are the two choices as I see it, and there's no single answer to it, because at this point it's the values of your society and what future they believe they can have and what will make them happy. So I'll leave it there, Matt.
Thank you very much, Herb. We'll get you to stop sharing your screen right now, and we'll move on to our first panelist, and we'll bring you back for Q&A and for discussion. We're still seeing your screen there, Herb, if you wouldn't mind, at the bottom of your screen.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out, I've got the...
There you
Did that
go.
help?
At the bottom of your screen, perfect. Okay, so we're going to bring on our first panelist. Kathy Simpson is an Atlantic Canadian IT leader who has dedicated her career to building the region's tech capacity. She's the CEO of Tech Impact, an organization with a mission to help the Atlantic region embrace and accelerate IT adoption and innovation as the cornerstone of its economic future. She's the board chair of the New Brunswick Innovation Foundation, an independent nonprofit corporation that specializes in venture capital and research investments. Following one of her passions in 2015, she created her own company, Up and Go, which focuses on cultivating the next generation of female leaders who will join our STEM, business, government, not-for-profit, and social enterprises. And Kathy, I already see so many good questions coming in, so we'll do our best to get to the audience by 1:30. But for now, the screen is yours, and we invite you to give your opening remarks on the New Brunswick economy and some reflection on what you heard from Herb. The screen is yours.
Can you hear me fine, Matt?
You're coming across great.
Perfect. So thanks everybody for joining us. You know, far too often when we hear the word IT or data or computer programmer, we have this stereotypical image of some geeky guy in a basement banging out code. It's been there for decades, so that image sticks and it's hard to shake. I think what's really interesting is that COVID-19 and the situation that we're in right now might be a catalyst to get rid of that image. And who would have thought it might be a positive outcome out of this difficult time? So for me and the work that I do in the tech industry, it's all about economic transformation. And when we work to create this Turning Point series, it was to engage in discussions about the innovation that needs to occur coming out of this pandemic. and the opportunities that can be created to transform our economy. And I believe, and so many others believe, technology is one important piece of a puzzle we can put together. So just think about some of the headlines and things that have changed in 10 short weeks. I recently saw a headline that said, "Rest in peace, The Office." The Office. The story went on to say that companies like Shopify and Facebook and many others are electing to not only extend their office hiatus for the year, but make it the new normal. We're starting to see companies removing cities on job postings, and they're putting locations as continents. We saw here in our province universities and colleges adapting and teaching online in a matter of days. We also saw massive in-person conferences with thousands of people moving online. You can talk to my 12-year-old daughter, and you can talk to her about what's her favorite digital platform now. Is it a Cisco product? Is it Zoom? Is it Microsoft Teams? And that's how quickly she has learned to adapt to be able to learn online. Over the past 10 weeks, we've seen companies scrambling to get people working remotely and doing extraordinary things to enable selling services online and more. It was nerve-wracking for many, but unbelievably empowering and inspiring to create that change that quickly. It was like dipping our toes in the water to see how cold or warm the water was, and do I want to dive in? Unfortunately, we also saw some businesses stop altogether because they didn't have the capability to work digitally, and that has been absolutely devastating. Or as we look at businesses without elements of automation, physical distancing brought manufacturing to a halt or caused a loss of productivity and income. So we've got big problems to solve. Herb took us through a whole handful of those. Technology, data, and capital are building blocks for innovation, and we need this in all of our industry sectors, whether it be the private sector, education, healthcare, in government, in nonprofits, and in our communities. We have some outstanding companies and industries that are so important to our New Brunswick economy. And we're going to need to rely on innovation to help them transform. And COVID-19 showed many of us this reality. And while it's a bit scary, most of us are doing okay with this transition. You might say an economic transformation has already begun in the past 10 weeks. Startups, entrepreneurs, technology companies bring the talent, the thinking, and skill to the table to help us reimagine a new way of doing work. We have tremendous stories here in our province. We have some of them you all know, but we've had success because we've invested in programs like Propel, like the NBIF, like RPC, in tech companies, in our university and college ecosystems. And we have so many more stories to build. So to make this all work, we need to embrace change. And we need talent. We cannot lose what we have. We need to build more, and we need to attract more people to our province. We need to adapt and change and take advantage of the opportunities that come in a world where work is done remotely from anywhere, from any continent. And let's do that work here in New Brunswick and help support New Brunswick companies who want and must transform to compete and grow. We need to build up our innovation muscle, and we need to flex it and get people talking about how we build these skills to build the very best New Brunswick industries and companies and leaders, and to help them transform the way we do our work and ultimately improve our outcomes socially, culturally, and economic. Let's make talking about how we innovate, how we use technology, how we build our talent, and imagine our new economy easy speak. In the past 10 weeks, we have advanced conversations at a lightning pace, and I hope it continues. But you want to know why? Innovation comes from collaborating around joint problems, and we have some big, hairy ones ahead of us that, to be honest, we don't truly understand yet. Geeky guys in a basement, come on. They don't exist anymore. We can do better than that. But incredible minds and teams do. And that's what we need to transform our province. In closing, You know, we're making space in the Turning Point series for these new conversations to help embrace and understand research, technology, the need for human capital, and collaboration as tools on how we leap ahead. We can't afford to slow down now. We need to accelerate as much as we possibly can. Thanks, Matt.
Kathy, thank you for those opening statements. And it makes me think that you're probably all sick and tired of this geeky guy in his office. So I'll make sure I quickly get off the screen in lieu of our next panelist. Louise directs the Conservation Council of New Brunswick's Climate Change and Energy Program. She's also an honorary research associate and instructor at the University of New Brunswick and a consultant. Dr. Como has almost 30 years experience in analyzing and developing climate change policy, communications, and solutions related programming. She holds a doctorate in environmental management focused on environmental ethics and behavior change from UNB. She has received 2 Queen's Citizenship Medals for her work in international climate negotiations and creation of green municipal fund and other sustainability programming at the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. Louise, I invite you to do the same, to share your opening remarks on the New Brunswick economy given our situation, and to reflect on what you've heard from Dr. Emery. The screen is yours.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much. Appreciate the opportunity. In fact, I appreciate it so much. I've actually put notes together that I want to follow a little bit to keep on time, but also to cover the key points. And the first one, just to open up and build on Kathy and Herb, is to talk about building from our strengths and what our opportunities are, but also this idea of redefining what we think success looks like. And I think that maybe it's because I do so much communications research that in many ways this comes down to framing. And I wanted to challenge although I appreciate totally where the noble truth coming from, I just wanted to kind of make a couple of points around framing and how it can open or close doors. Because framing does trigger our thought processes. It does trigger patterns of thinking. And that can help or hinder us, and most certainly can help or hinder our capacity to be confident. I'm a bit nervous about thinking about our options going forward from a position of pain in particular, partly because I know from my own research on behavior change that pain, more love, is actually a motivator. The more negative framing has got the wrong social psychology. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there, that part of these changes we're thinking about in terms of New Brunswick and the economy relates to how we frame things, how we're thinking about things, and that reimagining needs us to kind of come to terms with how we have these patterns of thinking that need to be adjusted. Let me point out just one other one, partly because of 30 years of work as a change agent, that whenever I'm told that I need to be realistic, I would say that that's generally been a story or a narrative built to maintain the status quo. And so again, framing, if we're into realistic, it's like, where are we? Are we trapped there? Are we in this box? How do we get out of it? And I also just, given what we're hearing and seeing in the States and how we're feeling very emotional about that, wanted to point out that often when a person's told to be realistic, it's often a woman being told to be realistic. And I point that out because there's an opportunity here to validate and respect different values or an understanding of the world, more of an interconnected world, a world driven by relationships, concerns for equality, safety, health, and a thriving social and ecological environment that can be part of our discussion around COVID recovery. So let's embrace some new framing and ask some new questions. And as a person who came to New Brunswick 10 years ago to do my PhD and chose to stay, I'd like to start with a different question, and that is, what makes New Brunswick great? Because it is great. And then maybe ask what's holding us back from building on our strengths, and to make New Brunswick a place where, as Herb says, where young people want to live, where new arrivals come and they thrive, right? How do we really look at it from that perspective? I'd really love to see a whole new series of panels, Matt, that are by young people, new arrivals, and change agents, and just let them go at what they think the next way of thinking might be for the province. And so this idea of language and measures of success, you know, there is as I think Herb also to a new generation of economists challenging the ideas that, you know, GDP, for example, is the only way to measure quality of life. Clearly, we are happy here. My own research shows that. I'm not sure I would leap to maybe we need pain in order to get growth. Maybe we could think that through a little differently. But I do think we need new economic activity based on dematerialization. And that leads me to just talking quickly about some of the strengths I see in New Brunswick that maybe are different than the larger scale perspective. I do see that we have strength here around small scale. There's something about New Brunswickers, we have a better sense and capability and skill set around self-reliance, and we are very connected to nature. I think these are strengths. It gives us a foundation, I think, for celebrating the small and the large. And to maybe look at ecological insights into redefining what efficient and productive is. I think the issue around food security, just as an example, does give us a new understanding of how more neoliberal economic thinking can make us vulnerable. We need to appreciate that perhaps some redundancy and smaller scale can also be resilient while sustaining local economies and generating a higher quality of life with lower environmental and social effects. So let me just give you a couple of examples of how we might reimagine from a green economy point of view. In the Globe and Mail today, just as an example, this is a conversation going on everywhere right now. Klaus Schwab, who's the founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum, called for a massive reset of capitalism. He's calling for a reset that would have three main components. The first would steer the market toward fairer outcomes. I think we've all been sensitized to this issue of fairness and issues of income and frontline workers and so on, issues of racism. Second component would ensure that investments are made around our shared goals for equality and sustainability. The third priority would be to harness innovations, as Kathy was talking about, through the fourth industrial revolution, as he describes it, aimed at public good as to address health and social changes. I think of the opportunities for telehealth as being one example of that. On the green economy piece, all of that I've just said is really an intro and to set up why I think we're missing an important conversation that's happening across the country and not happening as much as it could in New Brunswick. Just in the last few weeks, corporate nights led by the private sector business conversation laid out the contours of what a green economy could look like, very similar to Mr. Schwab and other corporate networks and governments around the world. And their Building Back Better roadmap would do a few things that I see as real opportunities for New Brunswick, would set us on the course to a more circular economy, eliminating waste, recycling resources within our industrial processes, significantly reducing pollution and stimulating the kind of green careers that young people want. And of course, working in the private public sector elements, as Herb was saying, there's an important public sector dimension here. But that innovation driven by these social and environmental needs, regulations, and financial incentives, I think are the key piece of it. And that takes me to the federal scene and what's going on there. I do a lot of climate change work, which means I work very much at the federal provincial interface and internationally. And the federal government is clear. They are looking at recovery focus that will advance social and environmental goals, particularly as it relates to transforming our economy into a zero greenhouse gas emissions economy. We know that policy, regulation, and legislation are essential to driving innovation and change. And I totally take on and accept the concerns we have in New Brunswick about our finances and the desire to have the federal government give us dollars, essentially, to help us recover. If we want that, then I think we need to argue for less flexibility that favors the status quo. And instead look to take in those federal dollars that helps us comply with federal regulations and more flexible regulations that drive innovation through compliance with environmental goals. And let me give you two quick examples before I close out. We've got over 60 communities in the province that have climate change adaptation plans as well as mitigation plans.
Luis, we are getting a technical interruption from your side, but with that, I don't mean to cut you off, but we will bring back our other panelists. So we would like to bring back Kathy and Herb at this time.
It's not the way we're trying to do.
Luis, are you back with us now?
A second component of that is an electrified economy. And so we're looking at a significant shift in electrification, both clean electricity, but also transportation that's more electrified, our industrial process is more electrified. And I think this recovery opportunity gives us a chance to do that. Final thing is to fixate more on our natural assets to help New Brunswick build on its strengths, ecological restoration, nature protection, and so on. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Louise. We do have to get to our panelists because we do have so many good questions coming in from the audience at this time. And I thank you again for talking about redefining and reframing the discussion. And that's certainly what we're here to do. I want to stay on COVID-19 just for 1 minute before we move on to audience Q&A. Kathy, first to you. We've talked about all of the things that COVID-19 has exposed. We know we've been exposed on many fronts. I don't think anyone ever expected to know what a supply chain was until today, and now we all do because that's our go-to for what's been exposed. But the office and the nature of work has been exposed as well. If we look at something like having to decentralize and distribute your office at the drop of a hat, if this happens again, the question isn't how many companies were prepared to do it. The question is how many companies are prepared to do it with no productivity loss. How do we increase that number?
Oh, I think we learned a ton in the last 10 weeks. And the difference from what I would say 6 months ago is now business continuity in the face of a pandemic has really become a priority. How many of us would have worked on a business continuity plan thinking that there's going to be a pandemic and you have to shut down all of Main Street and everything else with it? So if this happens again, I think businesses in the last 10 weeks have said, I've got to get it so that there is no productivity loss. So people, I think, are now at home working. Businesses are working remotely, and they're saying digital and a way to work remotely has got to be an essential part of how I work, and I cannot afford to have any productivity losses. And there are case studies coming out already that productivity has gone up because of the way that we're working. And there have been positive things that have happened to our environment because of the way we're working. Are we all getting sick and tired of working at home? Yes, like we still need that interaction with people. And I did notice in some of the questions, you know, there's real issues with connectivity. We do not have a broadband environment here across the country that enables this to happen as well as it needs to happen. And I appreciate Gaston's comments and questions in Q&A there. So we know we have work to do, and we know we have work to do, particularly in some of the rural areas of the province, or productivity is not going to be there. So I would say business continuity plans and digital strategies are core to business strategies now. And that's a big turning point from 3, 4, 5 months ago for many businesses.
Yep. And coming to you, Herb, in regards to COVID-19, I always think of you when I hear the field of dreams argument. You build it, they will come. That sounds like nonsense to me. They first have to come, and then we can build it. And you mentioned the 25 to 44 age group. That was the most daunting graph, in my opinion, in comparison to Toronto, that gray portion. Why do we lose those people, and where do they go?
So one reason a lot of people in New Brunswick are happy is if they have a good job, they're very protected here. There's a peculiar anomaly in our unemployment rates that if you hit that 25 to 44 year age group, you have much lower unemployment risk here than you do, say, in Ontario. So now you have to back up and say, well, then why isn't everyone staying here? It's because we put more risk onto labor market entrants. It's much harder to get into those jobs here, so you're losing young population to other areas with more opportunity. So one of the challenges in New Brunswick, and why I think people are so happy, is that you have a lot of security here if you have a good job. But again, there's a protectionism mentality for good jobs in this province you don't see in other places. Young people are here have to compete anyway, so The paradox is, if we believe in markets and neoliberalism, we impose it on newcomers and the young, and we protect everyone else. So they're in that market anyway, so they might as well go compete in Toronto, they might as well go compete in Alberta. So if you want that population here, we have to think about sharing opportunities so that there is more of a chance to get in on the ground floor. And universities across Canada are one of the worst offenders of this because the jobs are clogged. We've got incredible human capital sitting on the sidewalk just because we don't have a contract that allows them to come into the university and compete. And so if we ever get a university that figures out how to write a contract to let all that brain power come in, that's where we're going to get the R&D, the innovation, and the ideas. I'm at the end of my career, so we used to have mandatory retirement to push me out so that someone else could come in, but we don't have that anymore. And that's New Brunswick's challenge with the youth, is you have to create opportunities for young professionals and high human capital to do something here.
And if we see those 25 to 44s continue to leave in the numbers that they are we also going to have a serious succession gap when those jobs do come up on offer, when people like you decide to hang it up?
Well, in the 1990s, we did get that donut in the age structure because when I graduated, the federal government stopped hiring for about 5 to 10 years. And so they ran into a challenge that when they were getting retirements, there was no one of their 40s and 50s to move into the next step. So it accelerated opportunities for much younger people who are, say, instead of being 40 getting the job, they're getting it at 30. And so you do get these cycles around booms and busts. And in busts, we tend not to hire to keep the budget down. And so we've started referring to the Gen Xers like I was, we were the lost generation. Because we missed when they came back, they just went to the next age group coming in. They didn't go back like you're next in line. And so we're looking at, if we continue to have slow growth, we have a lost generation of young New Brunswickers who just aren't here anymore. We might catch the next group coming in, but as you get into the post-secondary discussion with David Campbell, you're going to see that we even have declining participation by our young in the training programs and education programs that would make them marketable here. And so we do have a bit of a problem that way. We have to think about the next generation and why would they want to be here?
Louise, up to you for a quick reflection on COVID-19. We've perhaps been nowhere more exposed than on the environment and climate front in regards to COVID-19. And I've heard it said that a crisis like this doesn't change the future, it merely accelerates it. There were all these things we knew we needed to do in regards to the environment and climate and sustainable growth that now we're being forced to do. Is there some low-hanging fruit we can institute for the long term? Things like pedestrian streets, maybe not going on cross-country business travel because now we're communicating successfully across the internet. Do you have any thoughts in regards to COVID-19 and what comes next?
Yes, certainly. I mean, I think the opportunity to work from home and have less commuting is a key one. Obviously, flying has been something that's reduced cruise activities, reduced as a result as well. But those are, I wouldn't consider those to be kind of the key big solutions. I'm really more focused on the systems level aspect of it because yes, we may see, clearer air in locations that have significant air quality problems. It's not an issue that we have here because there's been less coal burning or other kinds of industrial activity. But that has not changed the trajectory for greenhouse gas emissions because of the way they grow in the atmosphere each year. I won't confuse folks about that, but just to say they're separate. So we do need full on the low fruit, I think, in New Brunswick really does relate to electrification of our economy. I do think that there are opportunities for telecommuting and teleworking, and obviously the technologies we're using today. I've worked at home all my life. I actually always do my work this way, so it's been fantastic and my work doesn't change. I'm just so glad everybody else has come to realize I don't need to fly to a meeting. It's fantastic. But at the level of New Brunswick, our big challenge is to manage the transition in our electricity system, manage the assets that we have, to phase out polluting sources, phase in clean sources, and to do that in a way that's affordable and reliable. So I really think we need a process in New Brunswick around recovery and what we've learned from COVID that builds out that system.
Thanks, Louise. Over to you, Kathy. Last point before we get to the audience Q&A and the poll. We saw in Herb's slides that 4% is the ICT numbers. Should that be higher? Is the problem tech literacy? Do we lose our tech graduates? What's the 80-20 on growing that percentage number?
Yeah, we want to grow it unequivocally. You know, we've got numbers in New Brunswick now. We have about 180 tech companies. That's a variety of startups, scale-ups, regional companies, global companies. It's a whole bunch of different parameters there and what kind of markets that they serve. And we started something at Tech Impact. It's called Tech Talks, and we started doing it on campus, and we did it on purpose so that we could get the youth who are in engineering and computer science and business and mathematics understanding the opportunities that are here. Don't go to UMB, get a great computer science course degree, and then go to Toronto to get a job. There are amazing jobs here. So we have to keep the talent here, and we have to invest more in entrepreneurship and risk taking and provide capital so that we can get more companies establishing and being successful here. And that includes immigrants, that includes people going back to school, it includes that whole mix. So human capital, it seems like a weird way to talk about it, but having talent. And David Campbell always says this. He always talks about over-graduating, over-subscribing to programs. And in this new kind of remote world that we're living in, people want to have jobs in places like New Brunswick. So let's make sure we're doing everything we can to drive entrepreneurship and innovation so that we can grow that from 4%. You know, it's not the number we want. We want it to be a whole heck of a lot bigger.
And we're going to hash that out on the podcast as well with a fun segment where we'll dig into the tech side of things. Herb, I want to give the results of the first poll. So the first question that we asked you, the audience, was thinking ahead to 2030. In 10 years' time, if you remain in New Brunswick, do you see your quality of life? Where do you see your quality of life? Interestingly, 42% said better than today, and another 31% said about the same. If you look at the very top, significantly better than today, that's 8%, which is double the lowest answer, which is unless things change dramatically, I will not be in NB in 10 years. Does that go back to your point about how in the growth discussion, we often don't talk about how we're happy, and it seems to be like we're pretty content?
Well, I think my job here is done. Everyone's satisfied with the way things are gone. The interesting thing about that is there's a lot of us in New Brunswick that we're living in places where things are pretty upbeat and optimistic. So it's in some respects, if you think about if people who are living in the fast growing cities or anything along Highway 2, Route 2, there's not a lot of doom and gloom. And so there's reason for optimism because you see construction going on, you see cranes, you do see a lot of talk around, as Louise has pointed out, the greening of the economy. So things seem to be pointing the right direction. What I'm not clear about is it would be interesting to know where the respondents are based and how they're seeing it. So if I were to say go to the northeast of the province and we did this question, would I get the same distribution? But I think what I'd like to highlight is that there are a lot of New Brunswickers who are living in pockets of the province or a corridor that this is growing as well as anywhere in Canada. So it's a provincial growth problem, not a local growth problem. And there's been a lot of questions on the Q&A about what about rural? And the only thing I want to point out is that the only thing holding rural back are the same competitiveness challenges holding ICT back. Is that when you looked at the food crisis during COVID, it turns out we export a lot of piglets for slaughter in Quebec, but we don't slaughter here. So the exit economy in ICT is a similar thing. We have lots of little piglet startups that get shipped off for somewhere else to be fattened up and merged into somewhere else. So we have to look at why is it so hard to scale here? And electrification is going to be a huge part of that. How do you get the reliable, affordable power supply so that any type of business can make a go of it here without worrying about, am I looking at whipsaws in pricing or ever-ending increases? So again, I just go back to, I'm happy to see everyone's looking forward and saying things look good. We'll see how things go as we come out of COVID, but again, it's not that surprising given the experience most people are probably having in the cities.
Mm-hmm. And the second question, my personal well-being is going to improve with, we saw ironically, the winner was growth. So there clearly is, within the happiness community, there is a growth discussion as well. And if you look at the 12% growth of the maritime economy, you and I have talked about how in the Maritimes, the Atlantic provinces, we have a regional identity as well as a provincial identity. How does that factor into economic growth coming out of COVID-19? That's for you, Herb.
So again, the kinds of policies that you would go for would come down to this identity. So if I identified that my future is with my local city or local community, I would be fighting hard for getting assets and incentives to get investment there. If, on the other hand, I thought the ocean cluster in Halifax was my future in R&D, I would be urging the federal government just to pour money into the Maritimes, and I'll compete for it. So in a lot of respects, what we're seeing here is that the growth of the New Brunswick economy points to people see an opportunity from a healthier province. What we're going to run into is that the federal government doesn't think of provinces anymore. They may think region, but they tend to think strategic sector right now. They think individuals. So now we have to think about how do we get our province's goal of growing the province to align with how our funder is going to be looking at us compared to, say, just part of the Maritimes.
Mm-hmm. And we have a question from the audience. This one's for you, Louise, and this will likely be your last word. Barbara asks, hi, Barbara, what would be the best path to get our politicians to adopt a triple bottom line economy? Using only GDP causes inequality for people, especially in other areas of progress, such as well-being and environmental health.
Yes, good question, Barb. Well, it takes political courage is what it takes. And sometimes that means, you know, in the context of New Brunswick, where I have to be honest, I see quite a bit of resistance to complying with federal regulation. You know, the work I do is about encouraging the federal government to nudge us along and to support us in taking on our obligations and doing better. You know, we do have an opportunity for our performance to be measured with different metrics, as I said before, growth of what kind. And, you know, we can look at a measurement that has social, environmental, and economic criteria associated with it and look for that balance in our outcomes. So essentially right now, I think we're fortunate. Obviously, we need to do so much more as a country, but we have a federal government, I think, that's taking on this issue on a climate change perspective, not saying they're doing enough or everything they can, but more than I've ever lived through before. So we need to comply, and I think it'll be good for us.
Thanks, Louise. And this one for you, Kathy, coming from the audience, this will also likely be your last word before we go over to the podcast. Clifford, hi, Clifford. Clifford asks, are young New Brunswickers more inclined to participate in the gig economy versus traditional or up and coming industries? That's an interesting question because we do have a lot of opportunities in New Brunswick to layer on tech to our traditional industries.
Yeah, and you've just made some of your own career choices here, Matt, in the last little while about you know, creating your own entrepreneurship, which we congratulate you for. I think absolutely, you know, the sky's the limit. There's I'm celebrating 30 years in New Brunswick this year. I came to work for MBTEL, an innovative phone company, and who would have imagined how much innovation that's happened here in the province in 30 years, and how fortunate were we to work with that kind of company. And if you look at a bunch of the leaders in that organization, they have gone on to create a number of very successful IT companies. So we've got proof that it happens and people can be successful. And I think our youth, particularly in some of the entrepreneurship programs that are at the university, they're seeing that it's completely feasible. They're seeing it's about global marketplaces. They're seeing how important it is to get capital and how important talent is. So I believe there's going to be even more and more of that as we look ahead. But let's keep that talent here so we can let them grow from here, put it into our economy.
Herb, one quick final reflection from you.
Well, just I've been enjoying watching all the questions in the Q&A, and it would be interesting to start combining some of the themes that are coming out about what are our priorities, how are we balancing growth with other things we worry about, like inequality has been a big agenda in Canada for since 2008 in particular. it's been interesting to see that people have stayed talking about growth. Usually these things devolve into something about the deficit or healthcare, and we wind up fighting about that. But to me, we seem to have a lot of people listening in who are really focused on the economy and really thinking through what are the options going forward. And one question that I want to finish on that I've seen a few times is asking me why I pitch things as an either or. That's my professor hat, which is by making it either or, I force you, and Matt, you do this to us on podcasts, is that by not allowing you the middle ground, I force you to think through a position. But of course, these things can be done in combination and in balance. And we often pit you against one another because we say we're only going to fund one policy or one program. But the challenge we have out there is if you're really passionate about, say, local food, start identifying the opportunities and what you would need to make that possible, to be competitive with the big suppliers. And one CBC story I really liked was about the Fundy market, and just the story about how during COVID they've been able to get deliveries going and starting to marshal all the local food. It's a fascinating, what I would call grassroots story coming up that shows the best of using tech, using information, using coordination, and entrepreneurial spirit of someone who got some good training along the way in New Brunswick. So if you can find the CBC story on the Fundy market, it really was a terrific piece to illustrate the options that we have here. And the last thing is the commitment of New Brunswickers. This province is truly remarkable. And that's really the asset at the end of the day that you're trying to leverage, creating better opportunities for someone to take that energy and just do more of what they think will make the place better.
Thank you very much, panelists. Thank you, audience. We have so many questions to transport over to the podcast. We'll head over there now, and spoiler alert to you, Herb, we are going to be forcing you to take some positions over on the podcast as well. So thank you, audience, for your questions. Make sure you listen to the podcast, Growing Pains with David Campbell, to make sure that you hear your question be asked, and we'll dig back into the polls as well. So we're back next week dealing with New Brunswick's demographic and labor market realities. That should be fun. We'll hear from David Campbell, Natalie Savoie, and Amy Reed. Thank you to our partners. Head to turningpointnb.ca for recordings and more information about our panelists, and listen to the podcast. We'll see you over there. Thanks so much.